My boss caught me staring while sunbathing. Can you help me with my back? Can you help me with my back? She said it without opening her eyes. I had been standing at the edge of the hotel pool for approximately 45 seconds, towel in hand, pretending to look at the water. The water was not interesting. The water was not what I was looking at, and she knew it. Because Dara Voss knew everything that happened within a 20-foot radius of her at all times, it was. I had come to understand over 14 months of working for her, less a skill than a biological condition. The company retreat was in its second day. There were 11 of us from the office. 10 of them were at the indoor bar watching some sports thing on the mounted screen, which is where I was supposed to be. Which is where I had been until I decided to get some air and walked out to the pool and found my boss lying on a lounger in a yellow swimsuit, completely alone, eyes closed, a paperback face down on her stomach like she'd given up on it. I should have gone back inside. I had approximately 3 seconds in which going back inside was still a normal, available option. I did not go back inside. The lotion, she said, still not opening her eyes, still completely motionless. On the table. Unless you'd prefer to keep doing what you're doing. My name is Joel. I am 31 years old. I have, in the past 14 months, managed a full product launch, negotiated 3 vendor contracts, and presented quarterly results to a board of 12 people without once losing my composure. I stood at the edge of that pool and felt every credential I possessed dissolve completely. I wasn't. I started. Joel. She said my name with the specific patience of someone who has decided not to make this more uncomfortable than it needs to be. The lotion. I picked up the lotion. I sat down on the edge of the lounger beside hers. And Dara Voss, my direct superior. The woman who had hired me, who had put me in front of investors and sent me into rooms she trusted me to handle, who had told me 8 months ago in a performance review that I was the most competent person on her team in a tone that was entirely professional and made me think about it for 3 days. That woman sat up, turned around, and handed me the question of what exactly I was going to do with the rest of my professional life. I applied the lotion. My hands were only slightly catastrophic about it. Here is the thing I knew about Dara, the full inventory of it as I understood it standing at that pool. She was 37, the founder of a mid-size analytics firm that she had built from 11 people to 64 in 5 years. Someone who slept 4 hours a night and read industry filings for fun and had a reputation in our sector that preceded her into every room she entered. She had been divorced for 2 years. I knew this only because it had come up once in a work context, briefly. And she'd stated it the way you'd state a logistical fact. She had a daughter named Simone who was 9 and who she talked about with a precision and warmth that was the most unguarded version of her I'd ever witnessed. She kept her personal life at a careful and explicit distance from her professional one. She was, by every available measure, my boss, and had been for 14 months. And the 45 seconds at the pool were the first time that fact had ever felt like an obstacle, rather than a simple organizational reality. You can stop, she said, which was technically about the lotion. I stopped. I handed the bottle back. She turned back around and resettled. And I sat on the edge of the other lounger feeling like a man who had made several consecutive decisions he was going to have to think about later. She opened one eye. Sit down properly, she said. You look like you're about to flee. I sat down properly. I wasn't staring, I said again, because apparently I had decided to commit to this. You were absolutely staring, she said. You've been staring for about 6 weeks, actually, not just today. She said this with no particular affect, the way she delivered quarterly results. I've been deciding what to do about it, 6 weeks. She had been keeping a timeline. Of course she had. Dara kept timelines on everything. She had a system for her email inbox, a color-coded calendar going out for months, and a mental file on every person she worked with that was more accurate than most people's written notes. The idea that something was happening in her vicinity that she was not tracking was not a coherent idea. "I have a policy," she said. "I know you have a policy." She had a very clear policy. It was in the company handbook. It was reasonable and professionally appropriate, and it had never once felt like a problem until this exact moment. The policy exists because office relationships create power imbalances, and those imbalances create liability, she said. I wrote it for the company. I stand by it. "Okay," I said. "And?" she said. "It is the most inconvenient thing I have ever written." She said it looking at the sky, very evenly, like a person reading a verdict she disagreed with. I stayed very still. The pool light made everything the color of something unreal. "I'm going to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer it honestly. And then we're going to go back inside and attend the rest of this retreat professionally, and on Monday we're going to do our jobs. And that's going to be true for as long as you still work for me." "Okay," I said again. "Is this something?" she said. "Or are you just reacting to proximity and a nice afternoon?" She asked it the way she asked hard questions in strategy sessions, without softening, without preamble, with the expectation of an accurate answer. I had learned in 14 months that Dara Voss could detect hedging at a distance of approximately 30 feet and had no patience for it. I thought about 14 months. I thought about the specific way she looked when she was working through a hard problem, the stillness of it, the complete focus. I thought about the time she'd stayed on a call with me until 11 at night, because a client situation had gone sideways, and she'd said, very quietly, after it resolved, that she was glad I was the one who'd picked it up. I thought about the 8 months since the performance review, and how the distance between us had been perfectly professional and quietly intolerable, and how I had explained that to myself in 12 different ways, none of them honest. "It's something," I said. She nodded once, said nothing for a moment. Then, Monday, I said. We went back inside. We attended the rest of the retreat professionally. I watched her run a strategy session the next morning from across a conference table and thought about what she'd asked me and the answer I'd given and the word Monday and what it meant that she'd used it. Monday arrived the way Mondays do. Ordinary, demanding, indifferent to the events of the weekend. I was at my desk at 8. She was in her office at 7:30, which was her standard. We had a standing Tuesday debrief, not a Monday one. There was no meeting on the calendar. I worked. She worked. The office ran around us at its normal pace. At 4:15 she appeared in my doorway. "My daughter has a recital Thursday," she said. "I have a conflict, a board prep call that runs to 8 and I cannot move it." She paused. "Simone's teacher said a parent or designated adult must be present, or she can't perform. My sister is in Seattle. My ex is in Hong Kong until next week." She looked at me with the specific expression of someone who has arrived at a conclusion they checked 3 times before accepting. "I'm asking you because I trust your judgment and because you're the only person I know who would handle a 9-year-old's violin recital with the appropriate seriousness." "What time?" I said. 6:30. "The school is on Fenwick." "I'll be there," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. "Thank you, Joel," she said, and went back to her office. I sat at my desk for a while after that, looking at nothing. I had been to parent-facing school events exactly 0 times in my life on behalf of anyone. I had also never been asked to do something by Dara that felt, underneath the professional framing of it, like something else. This felt like something else. This felt like a door opening one careful inch. Simone had her mother's precision. She was small and serious, and when she walked out with the other students, she scanned the audience with a focus that was exactly Dara's. And when she found me 3 rows back, she stared for a long moment, and then nodded, once, very precisely, as if confirming a data point. I nodded back. She went to her chair. She played. She was excellent, genuinely, not in the way you say it about a child to be kind, but in the way where you find yourself actually listening, instead of politely attending. After, in the lobby, she walked over to me with her violin case and said, "You work with my mom." "I do," I said. "Are you her work husband?" she asked, with the straightforwardness of a 9-year-old who had heard this term somewhere and was applying it analytically. I opened my mouth. Nothing happened. "She talks about you," Simone said. Matter-of-factly. When she's on the phone with Aunt Claire. She says your name, and then she goes quiet for a second, and then she says something about work. I looked at this child, this 9-year-old with her mother's eyes and her mother's complete lack of social editorializing. "Did she ask you to tell me that?" I said. Simone considered this seriously. "No," she said. "I'm just observant." I drove Simone home. I met the babysitter. I stood in the front hall of Dara's house, which was orderly and warm, and had a child's drawings in frames on the wall next to a set of architectural photographs. And I thought about the person who had assembled this space, the precision and the warmth of it, the careful private interior of the woman I worked for, and felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with the policy. Dara called me at 9:15. "How was she?" she said. The board call was still audible winding down in the background. "She's excellent," I said. "Genuinely. And she's observant." A pause. "What did she say?" "She said you go quiet for a second when you say my name to your sister." A longer pause. I could hear her making the specific sound she makes when she's running a rapid the soft exhale of a decision in progress. "She's going to be insufferable when she's older," Dara said. "She's already insufferable," I said. "In the best way." Dara laughed. A real one. The one she didn't use in meetings. The one that was entirely unmanaged. I had heard it maybe 4 times in 14 months, and each time it landed somewhere in me that I didn't have professional language for. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight. For taking it seriously." "Of course," I said. "Joel," her voice went careful, "the policy." "I know," I said. "I've been thinking about it since Sunday. So have I." Silence, the kind that's full rather than empty. "I need to think about what's fair to you," she said. "And to the company. And to Simone, because she has opinions, apparently she does," I said. "Give me some time," she said. "Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. "And then, because I had stopped calculating, I've been giving you time for 6 weeks without knowing that's what I was doing. A little more is fine." Another pause. Then, quietly, "Good night, Joel. Good night," I said. I stood in my kitchen for a while in the dark. I was not worried, which surprised me. The situation was complicated, and the timeline was uncertain, and there were real professional stakes on the table, and I was not worried. I was just waiting, the specific, patient kind of waiting that is not anxious because it knows something is already in motion, already certain in its direction, already decided by forces that don't require your management. What I did not know was that something else was also already in motion, and it was not patient, and it did not have good intentions. His name was Marcus Webb. He had been with the company for 3 years before I joined, in a senior role adjacent to Dara's, with a title that suggested influence, and a track record that suggested he'd been coasting on the goodwill her name generated in the industry. I had learned this over time, carefully, in the way you learn things about a situation that no one explains directly, but that becomes legible if you pay attention. Marcus was personable and strategic, and had a particular skill for being visible in the right rooms at the right moments. And he had, I eventually understood, expected to be the person Dara promoted into the VP role she'd given me 6 months after I joined. He had been professionally gracious about it. He had also, I was about to discover, been quietly doing something else entirely. The email arrived in Dara's inbox on a Tuesday morning while I was running a vendor call in the conference room. I didn't know about it until she appeared in the doorway at 11 with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not the controlled versions of emotion she used in professional settings, not the warmth she deployed with intention. Something underneath all of that. Something that had been reached. She said, "Come to my office when you're done." I wrapped the call in 10 minutes and walked down the hall. She had the email printed out and face up on her desk. "Read it," she said. It was addressed to 3 members of the board. It was from Marcus's personal email, which meant he'd sent it outside the company's system to avoid it logging. It described, in measured and carefully sourced seeming language, a pattern of what he called preferential resource allocation in my direction, including client meetings, budget authority, and, phrased with enough ambiguity to be deniable, what he characterized as a personal dynamic that he felt the board should be aware of given its governance implications. He had not said anything that was technically false. He had assembled a picture from real data points, the meetings, the budget line, the recital, which somehow he knew about, and arranged them in an order that implied exactly what he wanted to imply, without stating it. I put the paper down. "How many board members received this?" 3, she said. Edwin Marsh, Carol Prentice, and Raymond Choi. The 3 most conservative members. The 3 most likely to view the implication as a liability issue rather than a Marcus issue. He timed it, I said. "The annual review cycle is in 4 weeks, she said. Edwin chairs it. If this sits in his inbox for 4 weeks without a response, it becomes the frame through which everything else gets evaluated. She was standing with her arms crossed, not looking at me, looking at the middle distance, running the problem. I recognized this. I had seen her run problems like this before. But something was different now. The way her jaw was set, the specific quality of what was underneath the control. "Are you angry?" I said. She looked at me. "I am precise about what I feel," she said. "What I feel is that someone used a private moment, Simone's recital, which has nothing to do with this office, as a data point in a professional attack. And that whoever told him about Thursday did so knowing exactly what he would do with it. Someone in the office had known. Someone had told Marcus about the recital, and Marcus had understood immediately what story he could build from it. 4 weeks before the annual review. The board. Governance implications. It was not an accident. It was a plan. "Who knew about Thursday?" I said. She was quiet. I told my E to put a note in my calendar. "She's been with me 4 years. I don't think it's her." She paused. "Marcus has visibility into certain calendar items through his project access level. I gave him that access 18 months ago because it was expedient. I didn't revoke it when his role changed." "So he saw the calendar note," I said. "He saw the calendar note," she said. Pause. "Okay," I said. "Then here's what we have. He's made an implication, not a statement. He's done it outside the company email system, which means he didn't want it logged, which means he knows it's an action he can't defend in the open. He sent it to 3 specific board members who will respond to governance framing, which means he's trying to set a narrative before you can set a counter-narrative. The annual review is 4 weeks out. He needs the story to calcify. She looked at me with something that was very close to the expression she'd had at the pool, the one that saw me clearly. "What are you suggesting?" she said. "I'm suggesting we don't let the story calcify," I said. "I'm suggesting you contact Edwin Marsh today. Not to address Marcus, to set your own agenda for the review cycle. Proactively. You've done that every year. Do it earlier this year. If Edwin hears from you before he has a chance to stew on Marcus's framing, Marcus's email becomes a data point in a story you're already telling, rather than a foundation he's building." She was quiet for a moment. "And the content of the implication itself is unsupported," I said. "Because nothing has happened. Because the policy has been followed. Because the policy exists precisely for this situation, and it has done exactly what it's supposed to do." She held my gaze. "Has it?" she said. It was not quite a question. "For now," I said. Something in her face shifted, very slightly. She uncrossed her arms. "Call pulled from Marcus's project access by end of today," she said. "I'll reach out to Edwin this afternoon. I'll pull the full budget and resource allocation data for the last 12 months, and I'll have it ready for review context." She paused. "And I need you to know that this changes nothing about my position on the policy." "I know," I said. "And that I'm aware of what that costs you," she said. "And what it costs me." "I know that too," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she picked up the printed email and folded it in half and put it in her desk drawer, which is what she did with things she had finished processing. "Go run your afternoon," she said. "I have calls to make. I went and ran my afternoon." Edwin Marsh called her back within an hour of her reaching out. He was, she told me later, entirely warm. He'd been planning to call her anyway about the review cycle, and had, it turned out, received Marcus's email with something between confusion and mild irritation, because Edwin had known Dara for 6 years and had a well-calibrated sense of what was a legitimate governance concern and what was a political maneuver dressed in governance language. Marcus had, in his calculation, made the specific error of sending it to people who knew the sender too well. Carol Prentice sent Dara a brief reply that said only, "Received a strange email from Marcus Webb this morning. Call when you have a moment." Which Dara did. Raymond Choi forwarded the email to Dara directly with no comment. Which was its own comment. Marcus had sent an attack to 3 people who were all, in their different ways, going to tell the target it was coming. His strategic calendar had misread the actual relationships in the room. 4 weeks before the annual review, he had handed Dara a document that demonstrated his willingness to use personal information as a professional weapon, sent outside company systems to avoid accountability, addressed to board members who all independently flagged it as unusual. By the end of that week, Marcus had a formal conversation with HR about communications conduct, and his project access level stayed revoked. He was still at the company. He was no longer a variable in anything that mattered. The annual review went well. It always did. Dara presented 12 months of growth data to a board that was fully contextualized, and I presented the operational results for my division. And afterward, in the elevator, Edwin Marsh said to me, without particular ceremony, that I was clearly the right person in the right role. And I said, "Thank you." And he said, "Dara has good judgment about people." And I said, "I know." And he looked at me briefly with the expression of a man who understood more than he was acknowledging and let the elevator doors open. 3 days after the review, Dara came to my office at the end of the day, after everyone else had gone. She sat down in the chair across from my desk. She did not have a document with her. She did not have her phone. I've made a decision, she said. I waited. I've thought about it every reasonable way, she said. I've thought about the company, and the optics, and Simone, and what it means professionally, and what it means to me personally, and what it costs in either direction. She paused, and I've decided that the policy applies to me the same way it applies to everyone else. Okay, I said. Which means, she said, that if this becomes something, which I think it should, I think it already is, it needs to be disclosed. Formally, to the board. And the structure of our working relationship would need to change. Not gone, but changed. Different reporting. Something clean. I'll support whatever structure you think is right, I said. That's not the question, she said. The question is whether you want to have that conversation. Whether this is worth it to you, knowing what it involves and what it might cost and what it requires. I looked at her across my desk. 14 months of her. Every version, the boardroom version, the 11 p.m. call version, the quiet laugh version, the version that put Simone's drawings in frames, the version that had asked me a question at a pool and listened to my answer without flinching, the version that had, under pressure, held a problem apart with her bare hands and solved it without losing herself. Yes, I said, this is worth it. She nodded. Slowly, then I'll make the call to Edwin Monday morning. She stood up. She was at the door when she turned back. For what it's worth, she said, Simone asked about you twice this week. Once to ask if you were coming to dinner, and once to tell me I seemed less stressed since Thursday. She's 9, I said. She's also correct, said Dara, and left. I sat at my desk in the empty office for a while. The city was doing its evening thing outside the window, indifferent and glittering. I thought about the pool and the lotion and the 45 seconds that had changed the direction of things. I thought about Monday morning calls and changed reporting structures and the specific, terrifying freedom of a door that opens in both directions. The call to Edwin happened. The conversation was brief and thorough. The structure changed, a lateral adjustment, clean and documented, professionally unremarkable. And then there was dinner, a restaurant Dara chose, a Tuesday evening in early December when the city had gone cold and the light through the window was the amber kind. And Simone came because it was the most natural thing, because she had apparently decided independently that this was already settled and simply needed to be acknowledged. She ordered decisively, argued with me about the soup, and informed me at one point that she had done research and that the violin piece she'd played at the recital was actually quite difficult for her level, and I should be more impressed. I told her I had in fact been very impressed. She said she could tell, and that it was one of the reasons she approved. You approve, I said. Provisionally, she said. I'm withholding final judgment for 6 months. Dara looked at her daughter across the table with an expression that was entirely unguarded, entirely warm, entirely the thing underneath everything else, and then looked at me. And I saw it there too. The same thing turned a slightly different direction, and it landed in me quietly and completely, and without any of the anxious calculation I might have expected. It just landed, like something that had always been on its way. On the walk back to Dara's car, Simone between us, Simone's hand in her mother's hand, and then reaching sideways to take mine also. Unself-conscious, decisive, entirely characteristic. Dara looked across Simone's head at me with a raised eyebrow. I shrugged. Simone said she was cold, and we should walk faster. We walked faster. If you've ever stood somewhere you weren't supposed to be, noticed something you couldn't unknow, and spent months doing the honest and careful work of figuring out what to do about it. Have you ever had someone look at you and ask if it's something, and you knew, instantly and without any pretending, that it absolutely was? Tell me about the moment you stopped performing and just answered true. I want to read every one of those comments. And if this story found you at the right moment, subscribe. There's more where this came from. What I haven't told you yet is the in-between, the 5 weeks between the retreat and the board review. The weeks that had no dramatic incident, no envelope on the table, no late-night call with a crisis. The weeks that were just work, just the ordinary business of two people who had said something true to each other and were now living inside the weight of it professionally, carefully, every single day. That part is harder to tell. It doesn't have events. It has moments. There was the morning she forwarded me an industry report with a 2-line note that said I thought of you when I read the methodology section. Nothing else. No context. I knew exactly what she meant, because the methodology section contained a flaw I'd pointed out in a similar report 2 months ago, and she'd filed that away and retrieved it when she saw it again, which is what she did with things that mattered to her. I read it twice, and then replied with 2 lines about the flaw, and went back to my work. But I kept the email in a specific folder. There was the afternoon meeting that ran long, a difficult client situation, the kind that requires everyone in the room to hold their nerve. And afterward she stopped at my desk on her way out and said, very quietly, just Joel, and no other words, in a tone that meant, good work, I saw you, I'm glad you were in there. It was 10 seconds, and it reconfigured something in the structure of my day. There was the Wednesday she was in back-to-back calls until 7 and I stayed because a deliverable needed finishing, and when she came out of her office at 7:15 and found me still at my desk, she didn't say anything, but she went to the small kitchen and came back with 2 cups of coffee and set one on my desk and went back to her office. I sat there with the coffee for a moment before I went back to the document. It was the best cup of coffee I'd had in a year. It was the same coffee I'd had every other workday for 14 months. The coffee hadn't changed. And there was Simone. Simone, who had apparently decided, in the 9-year-old way of having decided, that the provisional approval she'd announced at dinner was no longer provisional. She texted me from her mother's phone one evening. I knew because it started with, "Hi, this is Simone and not my mom," to ask what my opinion was on the relative difficulty of Bach versus Vivaldi for a student at her level, because she was arguing with her teacher about the spring program and wanted an outside opinion. I told her honestly that I didn't have the technical background to adjudicate, but that she should push for the one she actually wanted to play, because a performer who wants to be there plays better than one who doesn't. She replied, "That is actually useful. Thank you." And then, my mom is looking at me. I have to go. I mentioned this to Dara the next morning. She said Simone had informed her that she'd done research, and that I was a reliable third-party resource. She said this with her face almost entirely composed. Almost what I was learning, in those weeks, was the version of Dara that existed outside the frame of what I'd known. Not a different person, the same one, the same precision and the same warmth, but more of her. The part that isn't available in the conference room, or the performance review, or even the late call where you solve something together. The part that texts you about Bach from her daughter's perspective, that says your name quietly in a hallway in a way that means something, that chose a restaurant in December with good window light because she pays attention to things like that. I was learning that she had spent the 2 years since her divorce rebuilding the life she wanted on her own terms, not performing recovery, not filling the space with noise, but slowly and deliberately choosing the things she actually wanted. The company had been part of that. Simone had been the center of it. And I was starting to understand, without her having said it, that she was careful about what she let into that life, because she'd once let in the wrong thing, and it had cost her. And careful was not the same as closed. She was not closed. She was careful. And there is a version of patience that is not passive, that is active, that is present, that is fully engaged with what is happening, and simply not rushing it. And that was what those 5 weeks were. I was in them. She was in them. We were both paying attention. The Marcus situation broke the surface during week 3. That was when the email arrived and the afternoon conversation happened, and the week that followed, the one where I watched her navigate a political attack with the same precision she brought to everything else. I want to tell you what that was like to witness. It was like watching someone who has spent years being very good at something deploy that skill in a moment where it actually, personally mattered to them. The strategy was the same one I'd seen her use in client situations, in board presentations, in the vendor negotiations where the leverage was unclear and the outcome was uncertain. But the stakes were different. This time the thing at risk wasn't a contract or a quarterly number. It was something she had built over years, her reputation, her company, her careful and deliberate life, and she handled it without a single visible crack. I found that more affecting than I expected. Not because I hadn't known she was capable of it. Because I'd seen her do it for the company and the clients and the numbers, and now I was seeing her do it for herself. There is a difference. There is a version of competence that exists in service of things that are obligations, and a version that exists in service of things that are yours. She handled both the same way, with the same steadiness, and that told me something I filed away and returned to often. Marcus was, in the end, a small story. He was someone who had calculated incorrectly about the relationships, about the board, about what kind of person Dora was, and what kind of people she'd chosen to have around her. He had tried to use a private moment as a weapon, and it had bounced off every surface it touched. Because private moments between people of integrity don't work as weapons. They just look like what they are. Ordinary human things that someone tried to weaponize and failed. After the board review, after Edwin's comment in the elevator, Dara and I had a debrief that was nominally about Q4 planning and actually about everything else. We sat in her office at the end of a Thursday and went through the numbers for 20 minutes, and then she put the document down and said, "I want to tell you something." "Okay," I said. "When I hired you," she said, "I had a specific idea of what I needed in that role. Someone operationally rigorous, client-facing credible, capable of holding complexity under pressure. I interviewed 11 people. You were the clearest match." She paused. What I didn't anticipate was the other thing. "What other thing?" I said, because I wanted to hear her say it. She looked at me. "The thing where I find myself thinking about what you would think about something," she said. "The thing where I tell Simone something that happened at work and realize I'm describing you. The thing where 45 seconds at a pool becomes 6 weeks of noticing that I've been aware of you for longer than I understood." She said this evenly, in the tone she used for things she had thought through carefully and committed to saying. I did not build that into the plan. It happened anyway. I let it settle. "What are you doing with it?" I said. "Making a decision," she said. "Which I've done, which you know about, which leads to Monday morning and Edwin and everything that follows." "Yes," I said. "And I want to know," she said, "that you understand what you're agreeing to, not just the restructuring, the whole thing. Simone, who will have opinions in perpetuity. A work history that's now also a personal history. A person who will always be exactly this precise and this demanding and this unlikely to perform anything for your benefit." "Dara," I said. "Yes? I've been working with you for 14 months, I said. "I know what I'm agreeing to. I agreed to it in my head about 6 weeks before the retreat. I just didn't have the language for it yet. She was quiet. Then, very quietly, "Good." That was the conversation. That was all of it. We went back to the Q4 document. We finished the debrief. She walked out at 6:30, and I walked out at 6:45, and we went to our respective homes on the same evening in the same city, and that was Monday's call still on the horizon, and it was entirely, completely fine. The dinner in December I told you about, the one with Simone and the soup argument and the provisional approval, was not the end. It was an arrival, a different thing entirely. The end implies a conclusion, a closing. And what happened at that table with the amber light and a 9-year-old arguing about violin repertoire was nothing like a conclusion. It was a beginning shaped like an ordinary evening. The best kind. Simone took both our hands on the way back to the car and said nothing about it, because she had already processed it and moved on to whatever was next in her mind, which was probably Bach. And Dara and I both let her. And over Simone's head we looked at each other, and it was simple. Not uncomplicated. Nothing between two adult people with careers and a child and a company and a history is uncomplicated. But simple. In the way that true things are simple, present, known, already in motion. I thought about the pool. 45 seconds and a cold cup of coffee and a question asked without opening her eyes. How small a moment that was. How much it contained. I went home and I wrote about it. Not for ghosts this time. For myself, and eventually for her. And eventually, maybe for you. Have you ever had someone ask you a single, precise question and realize you'd been waiting for that question your whole adult life without knowing that's what you were waiting for? Have you ever heard your own true answer come out of you before you decided to say it? Tell me about that moment. Tell me if they were worth it, and if this story reached you at the right moment, the moment you needed it. Subscribe. There's more of this waiting. And it's all true in the way that matters.